Hello and welcome to my Christian fiction podcast, where I share stories with you. Right now, you're listening to Buried Secrets, written and read by Eunice Wilkie. Chapter 11. Late September 2022. Mysteries from the Wild podcast. Background material for Buried Secrets series, episode 9. Ron locked the safe and carried out his usual nightly checks of the archaeologists' canvas headquarters. The electric hot water urn had been switched off and unplugged. Check. The exhibits table was tidied, with all samples and finds catalogued, labelled and stored. Check. The laptop computers were backed up, powered down, and packed into their respective bags. Check. They were ready to be taken off-site for the night. He would keep them in his hotel room in Aberlochie. Everything was in order, thanks in part to Jo. He had to give her credit. Jo was an efficient assistant. Her computer skills, record-keeping, and general work were flawless. Granted, the seating area was a bit untidy, but that wasn't her responsibility. It wasn't her job to clean up after Ron, Gary, and the students who visited the site. She did the work required of her, no more, no less. In any case, Ron wasn't concerned with minor details like chair placement. He rarely sat in them. Gary was putting on his jacket, patting his pockets in search of his car keys, as he did every night. "You're sure that safe is secure enough?" he asked, nodding towards the metal safe, which was concealed behind a canvas-covered partition. His glance at Jo was not subtle. The implication was clear. She was the primary threat to its contents. Jo ignored him. She was also slipping into her jacket, which was several sizes too big. It was black, with a skull on the back, an image Ron hadn't noticed before. He supposed it was fitting for an archaeological dig, given that they had already unearthed 2 skeletons. Still, he doubted that was the reason she wore it. She made a deliberate show of checking for her car keys, mimicking Gary's movements just to irritate him. It worked. Glowering, Gary muttered, "I didn't think you'd need your car. You don't have far to go." Ron knew what he meant. Gary assumed Jo was heading no farther than the cottage down the hill, where her boyfriend, whatever his name was, would be waiting. But Jo also had a home in Strathavie, and most often drove to and from the dig. Ron sighed. He was good at analysing soil, rocks, and ancient artefacts, not people. Gary wasn't difficult. He was a solid archaeologist, respected in his field. He and Ron, both quiet and solitary, understood each other. Ron didn't want to lose him. Hiring Jo, however, had been a mistake. She was capable enough, but plenty of others could do her job just as well. And from day one she had been distracted, always hanging around that large, scruffy man who frequented the cottage down the hill. Ron suspected she had known him long before this dig. He didn't care what Jo did in her personal life, but the presence of that man was unsettling. too many strange incidents had occurred on site, and they had to be the work of locals. Local opposition made no sense to Ron. Archaeologists were usually seen as allies of conservationists and those opposed to development. Their findings could halt construction for years or indefinitely. What were the locals trying to hide? The latest skeleton they had uncovered? Then there was the so-called assault on Gary. It was a shove, but Gary called it an assault, which sounded so much worse. But no matter the label, Gary was threatening to quit over it. He insisted Joe was responsible, though he hadn't seen his attacker. Ron had warned him not to make accusations without proof, but Gary remained convinced. Who else could it be? Joe, offended by the claim, now ignored Gary completely. Their interactions had gone from awkward to non-existent. She spoke to the students, occasionally to Ron, but never to Gary. Even Ron, who was oblivious to most human emotions, could sense the tension. Maybe now that they had found a second skeleton, things would settle down. If someone had been trying to hide a murder, it was too late now. And if there were no more incidents, Gary might let go of his grudge and stay. And if Joe left, well, Ron wouldn't lose sleep over it. At least it was Friday night. He and Gary would return in the morning for a half-day of work, but Joe had the weekend off. The site would be peaceful for once. As they were leaving, Ron commented, "By the way, the police will be back tomorrow. They're interested in the ski-and-do dagger found in the grave. They think it might have useful DNA on it." Joe, who had continued jangling her keys just to annoy Gary, paused. "Useful?" she echoed. "Something you wouldn't know about," Gary muttered. Joe ignored him. "How would it be useful?" she pressed. Ron shrugged. "I don't know any more than you do. Just be aware they'll be here for it in the morning, in case I'm not around when they come." He saw Gary's surprise flicker across his face. "You're always the first to arrive," Gary said, as if Ron didn't already know this. Ron didn't answer. He never wasted words, and he had nothing else to say. He held back the canvas flap, letting Gary step out into the darkening evening. Joe hesitated, tugging her jacket's zip up and down absent-mindedly. "Do they think the murderer's DNA is on it?" she asked. Another shrug. "Ask them," Ron suggested curtly. He nodded towards the exit, and Joe slipped out. He followed, then tied the flaps closed behind them. Gary stood nearby, frowning. That look he got when he wanted to question something, but didn't want to challenge Ron's authority. Ron was his boss, after all. "Are you sure that dagger is safe here?" he asked, eyeing the flimsy canvas tent like it would collapse at any moment. Ron kept his tone neutral. "The security guard will be on site all night. It's just until morning." He could tell Gary didn't buy it. The man hesitated and shot a glance at Joe, not bothering to hide his blatant suspicion of her. Ron ignored it and took a step toward his car. The others followed. They walked to their cars in silence. Ron didn't look back. John shifted his weight and hunched his shoulders, tucking his arms into his armpits for warmth. The cold was gradually creeping in. Not that he was particularly bothered. He'd come prepared. His jacket, designed for far worse than this, was doing its job. One of the perks of mountain rescue work was that you knew how to dress for the cold. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Melanie wrap her arms tightly around herself. Just now she was shivering, visibly. With quiet irony, he asked, "Still glad you came?" Despite her discomfort, Melanie's face maintained its usual eager expression, as if the next moment was sure to be enjoyable, which, at the moment, was far from the truth. "Wouldn't have missed it for the world," she shot back, and despite everything, she meant it. John glanced at her. Her stocky frame looked even bulkier beneath her dark, waterproof jacket, which barely zipped over the multiple layers she had piled on. As always, her clothing was plain and practical, good quality, well worn, and chosen with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she liked and saw no need to change. It was a quiet reflection of her character, straightforward, no nonsense, and unapologetically herself. She never tried to be anything she wasn't, and that made her easy company. Until he met Melanie, John had never realized how much people's insecurities could be a burden on those around them. Now he appreciated the contrast she provided. She never felt the need to explain or justify herself. She simply was. Comfortable in her own skin, she didn't waste time trying on different versions of herself, or of anyone else, to see what else might fit. She was, in fact, the most refreshingly unself-conscious woman he had ever met. She looked outward rather than inward, was easily pleased, yet no fool. The chief super hadn't exaggerated her abilities. Her sharp mind, sound judgment, and remarkable multitasking skills had proved invaluable. Without her, he wouldn't have had the time to dig into the background research she had meticulously gathered before the case had even turned into a murder investigation. And now, thanks to her efforts, they had arrived at this moment, concealed near the ancient stone circle, watching the marquee that housed the archaeological dig. Despite the darkness, they had a clear view of the large tent and of the standing stones a short distance from it. The stones were the silent witness to anything that might happen tonight, as they had been to what transpired within their rigid embrace all those years ago. What had they seen? Who had been buried there? And who had been responsible for taking that life? A couple of police officers had watched the marquee during the evening hours, between the archaeologists leaving and the security guard arriving, but all had remained quiet. John and Melanie had taken up their positions before dawn, and now the darkness of night was beginning to lift as the first hints of daylight spread across the horizon. They doubted anything would happen while the security guard remained on site. The question was, would something happen when he left? Melanie was thinking about those who had committed murder, or at least disposed of the evidence, not far from where they now sat with their backs against a pine tree. It reminded her of something John had once said about human nature, that people were personal, reasoning, moral beings who knew right from wrong and had the freedom to choose between them. Those who had buried a body at the stone circle had made their choice, and for 45 years their secret had remained safely buried. I suppose the fact that we're investigating a murder is evidence that people are ultimately moral beings, even when they do immoral things, she mused. John remained focused on the tent, peering at it through his binoculars. Because we're treating murder as a wrongdoing that must be accounted for? Yes, we're acknowledging that wrong exists, and I think that some wrongs are always wrong, like murder, which raises the question, who decides what's wrong? John lowered the binoculars slightly. The sky had lightened enough that Melanie could see his face. His eyes were fixed on the archaeological dig, but his mind was clearly on their discussion. If atheism is true, then the universe didn't explode into existence with a ready-made set of rules. And even over time, how could mindless matter produce objective moral laws? Melanie raised her binoculars as she replied, "It's another blow against materialism, and even against other religious worldviews. They don't align with the reality that we have a moral code that another moral being must have created." She paused. Had she just seen movement south of the tent, in that cluster of trees? It could be a deer. They'd seen a few nearby. John continued, his voice steady. "Here's something else I'd never considered before. If the universe is purely material, and we are nothing more than a collection of physical parts, how could I arrest someone for a crime when their body has changed over time? Physically, we change as we age. Our cells are constantly replaced. We're not physically the same people we were years ago." So, the person who committed the murder and buried that body at the stone circle is different now. They don't have the same physical identity they did back then, Melanie said, cocking her head slightly, a habit she had when intrigued with a new idea. Exactly. Unless there is a non-material self that survives the physical changes, the person who committed the crime and the one being punished for it are technically different people. Well, there's a thought. Melanie exhaled a breath, wishing she was recording this conversation for later dissection. What a mystery this would make, the mystery of personal identity. Although she might lose half her audience if she started delving into philosophical puzzles rather than real-life ones. When I talk about myself, which you don't do often, John interjected. Melanie chuckled. Not much to say, but if I refer to myself, I'm not talking about my physical body. I could lose part of it and still be me. In other words, you're more than just material, John agreed. I think the reality is that people have souls. Melanie stopped when John laid a hand on her arm and nodded towards the marquee. The mist rising with the dawn had blurred the scene, softening the sharp edges of trees and structures. But as they watched, a figure detached itself from the cluster of trees near the marquee and moved silently towards it. The sound of canvas tearing reached them across the intervening moorland. John crept from their hiding place, moving swiftly across the uneven ground. Melanie followed, slower, stiff and cold from 2 hours of inaction. She reached for her phone and activated her recording app. Could it be that the perpetrator, perhaps the murderer, had walked straight into their trap? As she neared the marquee, she could hear voices and movement, but the canvas structure concealed what was happening inside. The only sounds she was certain her phone was recording were her own heavy breathing and the squelch of her waterproof boots sinking into the boggy ground. By the time she reached the tent, the 2 uniformed officers, previously concealed beneath the canvas, already had Simon Vass and purple-haired Joe in handcuffs. Melanie was astonished at how easily it had all unfolded. That they had fallen for the ruse so completely. That they had walked straight into the waiting hands of the police. It seemed almost too simple. John, looking smug, handed her a cup of hot tea, freshly brewed by a police officer using Ron's supplies. "Desperate people do desperate things, Melanie," he remarked. She pulled off her gloves and wrapped her hands around the warm mug, watching as John conferred with the officers escorting the suspects back to the station for processing and questioning. Simon hadn't attempted to break into the safe, but he had provided them with more than enough evidence when he tried to steal the entire thing. The real question was, who had he been trying to protect by removing the dagger supposedly bearing incriminating DNA? One thing was certain. Simon couldn't have been the murderer in 1977. He had only been a child. But his father and brother had just moved way up the list of suspects.